Good afternoon, book lovers. Robert Boyd coming at you with yet another book report. Today we're looking at this book, Renee, Tardy, Prisoner of War and Stalag 11B, After the War, by Jacques Tardy. It's the third book of a series, and I'm going to show you the covers of the other two books here. That are biographies they comprise a biography of Jacques Tardy's father, René Tardy, who was a soldier for France, and he was captured almost instantly after the war began. He was a tank commander, and he spent the entire war in a stalag as a prisoner. And I've written about these books before, and I'll put links to those in my description. And I was surprised that there was a third one, just because the story is so neatly wrapped up in the first two. Because the first one is about him, his days as a soldier, and how he's captured and transported to, I think, Pomerania, or wherever Stalag 11B is. And stayed in utter misery for the entire war until it looked like the Russians were about to arrive, and his captors marched him and his fellow prisoners out towards the west. And eventually his captors, deserted them, and some of them were hung by the putative prisoners. And Germany had fallen. And then he ends up back in France with his wife. And this was based on an interview that Tardy did with his father, because he wanted to capture this information before his father died. And thank goodness. But the after the war stuff is it doesn't have the same urgency, because he's not a prisoner. He's not making a odyssey from his prison to his home. And in that sense, the first two books reminded me a little bit of the two books that Primo Levi wrote about being a prisoner at Auschwitz, and then about the insane odyssey he had to take in order to get home from Auschwitz. But the third one just sort of tells us about how René Tardy and his wife settled in France after the war, how Jacques was born about a year later, along with millions of other babies all around Europe and the United States, beginning of the baby boom. And Jacques, who had been incommunicado, suddenly hears a lot of stuff that happened in the war that he didn't know. And so that becomes part of the book, but also their day-to-day life is the major part of the book. So things that happen to his friends, things that happen to their relations, and so on. It's not quite mundane and quotidian, but it veers towards that. And after the war, that seems kind of a relief. So anyway. Let me talk about a couple of specific things. One of the things he didn't know about the mass deportation of Jews from France, and or the Holocaust in general. So one of the things that he finds out about is that that Jews were rounded up, and they weren't rounded up by Nazis. They were rounded up by Frenchmen. Pierre Laval, who's the president of Vichy, and ordered the French police cooperate with the Nazis. So most of the roundups were done by, Pierre the policeman is mentioned, and Laval, a despicable human being, was rightfully executed in 1945. And for whatever reason, France didn't exercise its ultimate penalty very much for its collaborators. But Laval did not get mercy. Then, he talks about the Nuremberg trials and how all these Nazis were, taking cyanide to avoid being killed by their by the Allies afterwards, and whenever he shows them like chest deep in a field of bones, and that's a haunting image, and it runs all the way through the book, and um, and then when Stalin dies in 1953, we see an image of Stalin, and he's also chest deep in a field of bones, and Tardy writes that Stalin, some considered him a god, and others considered him a vile bastard. In the translation, by the way, is by someone named Jenna Allen. I don't know who she is, but I think she's really good. She's a good writer, and I think that's ultimately what you need to be a good translator. Um, and when I read that, it made me think of the Tony Judt book uh, about French intellectuals after the war, and how about half of them were super apologetic about Stalin for some reason. Uh, their rationale was, to have a revolution, you have to break a few eggs, and who are we to judge what you have to do to make a successful communist revolution? But they were, frightfully dishonest, and Jute rightly takes them to task. He writes a whole book about it, but Tardy manages to basically say the same thing in one sentence. And then the image I'm going to show you next, which is has a poster for the French Communist Party with a little dead girl on it, that apparently frightened Jacques Tardy as a little boy, and then has René Tardy going off on a tirade against the communists, noting, for example, that the French communists didn't join the resistance until Hitler invaded Russia. Um, so the field of bones image continues, and we see it with Napoleon here. And Napoleon, I, he's being used as an example of someone that a super patriotic French woman, Tardy's grandmother, admires, and and then at the very end we see Marianne, the symbol of France, in the sort of the same way that Uncle Sam is the symbol of the United States, chest deep in a field of bones. And that's when we learned that it's 1953, and finally Rene Tardy quits the army. He had stayed in the army and was part of the occupation force in Germany, in the French zone, with his family, because it was hard to get a job right after the war. There was a big recession, or really a depression, all over Europe. And finally, he quit in 1953, which was good timing because he didn't have to go to fight in Indochina. And anyway, that's basically the end of the story. But like I say, we do get most of it is like personal stuff. Tardy being born, Tardy growing up and making his first friends, Tardy living a little bit in Germany, and the cover shows you this half timbered town that they lived in, and the talking a little bit about the French zone, which was two triangles hanging off like the southwest side of Germany that I guess appeared like two breasts, and so it was referred to colloquially as the bra. At least on the map it does, and how he discovers comics as a small boy, and this image I'm showing you now is him reading Marsupilami, which is a great comic by a man named Frank Hahn, who is an amazing cartoonist, and he's noting that when Frank Hahn died, like 30 years later, Jacques Tardy, got to draw the cover to some news magazine memorializing him. Um, and I want to say a little bit about Tardy. He he's considered one of the greatest cartoonists alive, and it's definitely one of the greatest French cartoonists alive. And I first came across his work. I was either in junior high or high school. It was an early issue of Heavy Metal magazine, which reprinted a lot of interesting French cartoons. I think most people remember it for introducing Americans to Moebius, a great cartoonist, but there are a lot of other cartoonists in there that I remember quite vividly. And one was Tardy, and Tardy in Heavy Metal was they serialized a strip he did called Polonius, which is set in like ancient decadent Roman times. And I remember as a kid reading this, seeing like Roman orgy scene where people are puking up all over the place and everything, being kind of shocked by it. And he has made a huge career for himself, doing books like Adele Blanc Sec, which why I'm drinking some white wine, and You Are There, which I'm showing. I think I'll show you the cover to that, which I think is, I don't know if it's his greatest book, but it's my favorite of all his books that I've read. And It Was the War of the Trenches, which is widely considered to be his masterpiece. And what was really interesting, I noticed while I was reading After the War, that Tardy talks to his grandmother about his grandfather's experience in World War One, and you realize that he used some of that anecdote that his grandmother told him directly in It Was the War of the Trenches, which is otherwise a heavily researched book, but it made it feel all the more real to know that he used his grandfather's experience. And this image, I'm going to show you an image from It Was the War of the Trenches and from After the War, and you can see that they're identical. So it basically just reused the same image, but his grandfather had stumbled into the guts of a dead German and got gut stuff all over his hands, and he was deathly afraid of getting gangrene because his hands were raw from carrying weapons and so on. So he immediately washed it in like a stagnant puddle, and that image is a vivid example of the horror of war, but also of what the tenor of It Was the War of the Trenches is. Then after Polonius, I worked for Fantagraphics, which is are the people who published After the War, and we published some Tardy, and he could never catch on, and this was in the late '80s, early '90s. No matter how hard we tried, we just I don't know, we couldn't understand why this was not appealing to American readers, but it wasn't. I was the editor of an anthology called Pictopia, and we published one of his hard-boiled detective books called Griffu in serialized form. And he loves detective stories, so a lot of his books are detective stories, or crime stories, I guess would be a better way to describe them. And with Adele Blanc Sec, he likes taking an adventure story set around between the turn of the century and say 1920, and that I'm not sure what you call that epoch in France, but he liked that look and he liked the fantasy of it. So it's a little bit Jules Verne, but it's also the heroine Adele Blanc Sec is cynical to the extreme. So she is a very amusing heroine. And he uses that setting, that early 20th century setting, from time to time in his books, but he'll have contemporary books as well. So he's not always looking backward. But in this series about his father, he was. And because he interviewed his father to get this information before his father died, I think some people probably compare it to Mouse, where Art Spiegelman interviewed his father to get his story of Auschwitz. And admittedly, the French prisoners of war, it's not quite it was definitely not the tragedy of the Jews and the Holocaust, because they weren't being slaughtered, but they were being treated very poorly, and if they died, it was not that big a deal. Um, they were being treated better than the Slavic prisoners, the Russians and the Poles. When they were caught by the Nazis, they would be treated as slave labor and worked to death. But they were treated much worse than the Americans and the British, because the Germans hadn't conquered the Americans and the British. So the Americans and British had German POWs, and they didn't want to. If they mistreated their American and British POWs, then they could expect the same from the British and the Americans with the German POWs. So the French were, kept barely alive, and they did have a purpose beyond just being a mouth to feed, which is Germany would trade Vichy France something like one POW for 3 workers. So a lot of a lot of French workers went to work in German factories, essentially as kind of slave laborers, and then that was, well, for some reason Tardy, I can't remember why. It's explained in the book, but it's been so long since I read it. He didn't take that deal. He stayed a prisoner all the way through the war. Anyway, it's a good book by a truly great cartoonist, Jacques Tardy. I recommend all his books, but definitely the 3 books that comprise this series, I, Renee, Tardy, Prisoner of War, and Stalag 11B, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Also, It Was the War of the Trenches. You Are There, I recommend that one. And all the 2 or 3 Adele Blanc-Sec volumes published in English. Most of these were translated by Kim Thompson, who was my boss when I was at Fantagraphics, or one of my bosses, I should say, when I was at Fantagraphics, and he grew up in the French school system, so he was fluent in French, and so he was a more than adequate translator. But I have to say, this Jenna Allen person, I like her translations better. She's a better writer than Kim was. But Kim was a great guy, and I love him, and I miss him. Anyway, that's it for this Jacques Tardy book. I hope you like it. Thanks very much.